Welcome to the Insights Unlocked podcast. I'm Nathan Isaacs, Senior Manager for Content Production at UserTesting. And joining us today as host is Mike McDowell, a Senior Solutions Consultant with UserTesting. You may know him from his popular LinkedIn and YouTube videos on UX research. Welcome back to the show, Mike.
Thanks. I got to say, it is super awesome to be here, not only on the podcast, but also with such an amazing guest that we have today.
And speaking of guests, our guest today is Caroline Jarrett. Caroline is a forms and surveys specialist. She's the author of Surveys That Work and co-author of Forms That Work and User Interface Design and Evaluation. And this marks the 30th anniversary of her consultancy, Effort Mark. Congratulations on the anniversary and welcome to the show, Caroline.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
And I just want to say congratulations also, Caroline, on 30 years. But such a huge milestone to hit for a company. Heck, I used to work for Hertz. They're over 100 years old. Even they were almost not here anymore. So really excited for you that Effort Mark has just been in business and all the great stuff that you're doing. I cannot wait to get into our discussion today. As you mentioned, we talked a little earlier. I am a bit of a form geek and survey geek as well. So this is going to be really great.
Thank you.
I started reading your book. Admittedly, I didn't get through the whole thing, but really it was very exciting to see some of the awesome detail that's in there and things that I had literally no idea about. I tend to think of surveys as it's a survey, and it's a form. And your book, you go into, it's not just a form, it's a process. And there's a lot of different kinds of processes and a lot of different kinds of surveys, physical things. The idea of methodologies, and I kind of laughed actually out loud when I read this in the book, which was like the survey that you should, two types of surveys, like the one surveys you shouldn't do, and then the other. Yeah. When you think about methodologies and people ask you to do a survey and you don't think it's the right method, you think it should be an interview or something else, how do you broach that with people? How do you help convince them that actually you should start with more in-depth interviews first before you go and do this mass survey to cut down on that total error, number that you're going to have there? So
yeah, I mean, that's really interesting because I think the conventional wisdom, or what I believed before I started reading into this, because I've seen it so often, is that what you would typically do is do a survey first and then interview to get more depth experience. And I learned from the survey methodologists that is not what they do. Okay, they always start with interviews, right? So you need to interview first to practice your questions, to get a feel for the kind of vocabulary, to find out what issues matter to your potential respondents or people who are going to answer your survey or population of interest. And so it was like, okay, so it's not like an alternative to doing a survey. An interview is a necessary part of doing a survey. And once I realized that was quite important to me. And to say, well, interview first, I even have a poster on my website which says listen first, ask second. And that's part of that inspiration. I mean, it's available as a free download poster, so print it and stick it around your office or whatever. Because it's around really, you need to understand what matters to your people who are going to answer and make sure you've got those concerns and thoughts, even how they speak about it. So I think we've all seen surveys where we've been asked to assess some sort of jargony product thing. And it says, what do you think about jargony product thing V2? And you think, I don't even know what jargony product thing is. Never mind whether I like V2. Whereas if you'd been told, it's I can't think of an example now, but I mean, we could actually relate to the object in the real world or the thing in the real world. Whereas when we're faced with all this jargon, but obviously to the organisation that's asking the questions, they full well know that those two things are the same. So that's just necessary. And so sometimes I've been able to postpone or get second thoughts about a survey just by helping a colleague or a client to say, well, that's great, let's do that. Well, let's have an idea of the questions we want to ask, and then we'll check them in an interview to see if they're making sense. So we're doing the interviews, which perhaps are all we need, but we've dressed them up as being a necessary and important step towards doing a survey.
That's our whole philosophy at UserTesting, is about iterating. Testing is not one and done. Research is not one and done. You don't just you learn something through a qualitative study, and then you go, oh, one person said that, now just go act on it. No, then you do follow-ups and you figure it out and you dive deeper. Maybe you do a survey. The idea of doing the interview first, I love that statement. Before you said poster, I thought, oh, that's a t-shirt right there, is, listen first, ask second.
Well, it's Creative Commons licensed image, so stick it on a poster. And I know the illustrator I work with would be very amused if that happened.
That'd be great.
Stick it on a t-shirt, by all means.
But, user testing, we just launched a survey capability ourselves. And it was very much because of the fact that, we had the qualitative studies, we had the live interviews, but we wanted to go get the in-depth decision-making part of it, like decision support with a big questionnaire survey. So we definitely are encouraging people to use multiple methodologies through the course of, we call it your product development lifecycle or ideation, all these things that at different stages call for different methods. And a lot of times people, when they do they'll do generative research. They'll just, hey, I want to watch people use my product, use my website. And I'll give you an example about that jargony thing in a second. And it's like, okay, now that I've seen this issue, let me figure out, how common is this issue? And then how important is this issue to people? Do they understand? The jargony thing. In my history, I worked at Hertz for 22 years, leading all their e-commerce stuff. We had a GPS system. We were the first ones to implement this GPS called Never Lost. And in the page on the website, the form where you picked off the options, it said Never Lost, the in-car navigation system. And it wasn't getting selected very often. But when I compared our competitor, Avis, theirs said GPS navigation powered by Magellan. And it was like the layman's language is right up front, and then the branding is at the end. Whereas we were so hyper-focused on the branding, and then we'll tell you what it is at the end, that it didn't surprise me that people would just skip over it as they skim the content on the page.
But I think it's really interesting that you're talking about that, but the specifics about the jargon. But I also want to pick up a little bit on the decision, because for me, the whole point about us doing surveys out in our everyday lives, I think, is to encourage us to tie the reason we're doing it back very closely to making a decision. Like, what decision do you want to make based on what you find? And does that decision need a number? Okay. Does it need the numeric? A survey is a quantitative method. The result is a number. I'm not talking about the number of people who respond. Okay, 5,000 people answered the question about your preferred candy bar. That's not the number. The number is 18% said they liked Snickers. It's that 18% type of thing that's the number. And so, I take people through a four-step exercise, which is, what do you want to know? That's pretty easy. Why do you want to know? Generally fairly easy. What decision will you make? Often a lot trickier because they haven't drilled down to that level. And then what number do you need to make the decision? And that's often really tricky because they haven't, okay, if 18% prefer Snickers, then we're going to stock some more Snickers in our in our convenience store, right? They haven't actually worked out that what percentage they're looking for or that kind of thing. And so that can often be the opportunity to say, yeah, think again, maybe we need a different method right now because you don't actually need a specific number. Whereas the example you gave is exactly where like a survey really makes a lot of sense to me, as to say, we've observed these problems, we want to count how many people care about that problem. That's a number, If
right.
It's like only 1% of our audience, well, is that the highest priority for us, or will we just let those people suffer and work on something that affects 3% or,
Yeah,
so
sadly, that was the methodology that we used a lot. I was in charge of analytics as well.
Right.
So fortunately, for every single form that our website had, every single error was captured and quantified. And that was the way that I would drive how I would go and do work was what would be, I used to call them reservation killers. Like when this error happens, the conversion rate drops so low that we may as well, they're never going to book. So that's where we should focus and so on. But actually, it was really great that you just talked about the methodology and the 4-step methodology. One of the things that you talk about in the book that I really love is the MVQ. is figuring out what is the most valuable question in this questionnaire, and do all the other questions support us getting to that most valuable question or most important question, so that we can get to those answers and that number and the actual point of all this, as opposed to what you said at the beginning, which was just throw a survey out there and ask a bunch of questions and see what we get back, you know?
So that really makes me laugh, because I've been caught on my own jargon. Like, you called it most valuable question, which is an absolutely sensible and probably a better name for it.
Oh, was that not what it was called?
No, it's most crucial question in the book, but don't worry about it. It just illustrates that jargon isn't nearly as important to the person who... You're my user of the book, and you've made a very sensible... I don't mind you using most valuable question at all. I love it. It just happens not to be what I called it, you know?
Oh, that's too funny.
Yeah, I talk about the most crucial question because sometimes it's like, well, when we think about that decision, what's the crucial question that we want to know? Right? So in the branding world, we might say, do people appeal, does this branding term appeal to people more than that branding term? That's a very legitimate thing to ask. And that is not necessarily the only question we'll ask in the survey. We might need to build up to it, but at least we know what that really crucial question is for the decision. So it can really help, because there's this sort of kitchen sink thing. There's like, oh, well, we're going to do a survey. Let's pile every possible question onto it. And that makes the survey boring. It makes it more difficult to get responses. It takes longer. Everyone is arguing about it. So I'm absolutely happy to have the pile on of questions. Let's welcome them all, and then let's fill them down to which is the crucial question. Or maybe, this is the real world, be realistic, maybe there's more than one, but you really want to try and get down to that minimum set. Because it's not that you won't ask, it's like we are now in 2024, and we don't have to only do one survey a year. We could do another one next week or tomorrow or even in an hour. We have the technology to do that. So what could we do that's light and simple and focusing on that most crucial question? It's a good, the most whatever question, I don't care what we call it, but the idea is there, yeah.
Well, and you just touched on the other thing that really I love, because nothing is worse than you saying, hey, would you agree to do this 15-minute survey or whatever? And then you click into it and it says like question 1 of 94. And you're like, well, I'm not doing this. I'm not going to do this. So the idea of the light touch survey and doing these smaller surveys that really just ask those critical questions, and then iterating, doing more. Like, all right, let's learn what we need to learn from this.
Right.
And let's not bundle too many things into it. We tell people that with their qualitative studies as well. Like, well, can I show, how many questions is the right amount of questions? And then I see like a 45-step thing. I'm like, you realize when someone sees 45 steps, it doesn't matter how short it is, the steps individually, they're going to rush through the first 20. They're just going to rush because they think it's going to take forever. So you have to really set people up for success and to get the successful feedback and output that you want, which of course transition us great to the design and the design process of surveys. And I think you talk about testing of surveys, and we're huge proponents of testing your research before you go big. Run it to one person and then go big. Run a survey with a qualitative layer on top of it to hear people talk about the questions that and the way they are and the way they're being asked. Are they offensive? Are they too personal? Things like that. You want to learn those things before you go to 1,000 or 2,000 people and really waste a huge sample of audience that you have access to. So in terms of testing and design, have you ever run into a situation where someone gave you a survey or their idea for a survey clearly had never been tested, and you said, okay, we're just going to have to massage this a little bit?
Oh, like every time? It is very, very typical for the actual questionnaire, for example, never to have been tested, and even I subscribe to quite a few kind of panels and stuff just to see what people are sending out. By and large, I'm a very good respondent because I want to refresh my library of screenshots. And, I've had surveys from respected market research organisations working with serious government departments that have just got plain wrong questions in it, stuff that's never been tested by anybody. And you think, well, how did that slip through? So we all, those of us who work in the usability testing space, know that you can kind of really not do too much testing. I mean, there is a point where you have to say, stop, we're going to ship it. But that kind of iteration mode, and let's test absolutely everything. Let's test the actual questionnaire. Let's test the invitation. Let's test the process of dealing with the results. Let's test the report. Do a little one, give you a chance to test everything. And you think, well, we're very fanatical about testing because we work in that space. That's nothing compared to the real survey methodologists.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. That was really fantastic, actually. I love the variety of methodologies there. And, obviously, as we start winding this down, I do want to tell you one little thing about the form design. I want to get your take on it. And then I'll ask you one or two last little questions here. But so when I was doing my Six Sigma certification, I chose form optimization as my project. It's a very specific form that I was working on, or that I owned. And I had all the errors on it. And one of the top errors on the page, when they submit it, it comes back with the big red error messages. One of the top errors was your email addresses don't match. Okay, so big red. Now, before I even say what the issue was, do you have any theories why the email addresses didn't match would be the top error, or one of the top errors on the page?
At this moment, I'm just going to hear what that was. I'm going to let you go straight for the punchline.
The reason was that the second email, like the confirm your email address field, was being constantly left blank. It was always being left blank. And what I figured out through some very good guidance from research from, Nielsen Norman, was I was using left-right juxtaposition on fields that didn't have a natural left-right juxtaposition. So email address was there, and then enter your email address again was next to it, and people just didn't see it that way, like first name, last name, things like that. So
you mean you had them side by side, not on top of each other? Oh, yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, invisible. Yep. Totally invisible.
I moved it underneath. Error went away.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, the reading pattern for questions is quite different than for text. It's like, people's eyes go to the box where they have to answer, and they ignore everything about it. And then, in fact, you might be interested that Jen Romano and I wrote a chapter on eye tracking for forms and surveys. It's available on my website if you don't want to buy her whole edited chapter book on eye tracking. But it's incredible the extent to which they laser beam into where's that box for me to type into. And then they start looking around in a circular pattern for where's the information. And so if you put something to the right of that box for them to do next,
Nope.
Yeah.
And that was also, there was that great guidance on, a lot of people navigate forms with the tab key. And some people got into the habit of putting the form label, the field label, inside of the form, inside the box itself. So once you've tabbed into it, it disappears, and then you have no idea what you're supposed to enter.
Yeah, no.
Horrible interaction design.
I've been campaigning against placeholders and hint text inside the box for, I remember I've been campaigning about that for years and years. And when I say years and years, I don't just mean like a few years. I mean that I was so bored with campaigning on that in 2010, right? That in 2010, I decided I no longer wanted to do talks on label placement in forms. And I started uploading all my slides to SlideShare in the hopes that I would never have to do that talk again. And 14 years later, I'm still doing the talk. 14 years later, people are still putting the labels in the boxes. So it just shows how...
As they say, bad habits are tough to break, right?
Oh, unbelievable.
So we're talking about now 14 years later, 30 years later, technology today, a lot more survey tools are out there. A lot more people are using surveys for right or wrong situations. But obviously the talk of the day is AI. And, what is the influence that AI is going to have, especially on things like research, where you can just ask an AI, not AI like everything, but there's different versions of it. You ask an AI some kind of question, and that is the research, that's considered research now. Do you see AI having a big influence on surveys and the way people get large-scale information? Or are they just going to start relying on AI for the answers? Or, will we continue on with sort of surveys as usual?
I just think it's great to be asked about how will AI influence the world of forms and surveys, because as if it's like AI was invented yesterday, right? We all know that. Like AI didn't happen before 2013, okay? It was like that. And the reason I find that particularly amusing is that my very first job as a student was with the European Space Agency, where I was part of I was a data checker on data that had come from a gamma ray satellite, and where it was a machine learning, as we now call it, artificial intelligence, massive program written by the scientists at the Space Agency, that was finding the images, doing image recognition on this data. And then there were a bunch of us students, and we were like the human checkers. Yeah. And so that was in 77. Okay. And in those days, what you can now do from your desktop for free required the resources of a space agency. But it's the same image recognition stuff, essentially. It's just cheaper and quicker and uses incredibly much larger amounts of electricity. It's like it's killing the planet, but hey, we can all use it, so let's not worry about that. So that's the first thing about AI. And then the second thing about AI is like, oh, how is it going to be now that AI is coming into forms? How will that change? I got into forms because of AI, not the other way around, okay? So I was using optical character recognition technologies where our tax authorities, the revenue, they wanted to scan the forms and use artificial intelligence to read the forms so they didn't have to type them in back in the 1990s. And I'd worked in optical character recognition previously, and so I got the job to implement AI for dealing with forms, okay? And the challenge was then that you imagine in those days it was pretty much all paper forms, but not exclusively, but let's just think about the paper form side. You've got someone who's handwritten on a paper form or typed on it. Okay, so you scan that and the computer AI tries to say, okay, they've written, 29.3 for their interest received on a bank account. Fine. That's fine. That worked fine. What wouldn't work then in 1992 and still won't work today in 2024 was when the person had written on the form, please see letter attached. Didn't work then, doesn't work now. Now, the AI that can work out that you've written 23 cents on there, and you have, do you know what I mean, the number handling, is cheaper. It's not much better now, but it is cheaper. But the thing that when you feed it something where someone has written, please see letter attached, it still fails. At worst, it fails really badly and tries to turn that into a series of nonsense numbers. So we still need people in the mix. And that's what got me interested in, well, okay, how do I design forms so that people fill them in correctly? So I get sensible things for my AI to feed off, not a load of stuff that it's never going to make sense of. So right back then, we had to understand what's the capabilities of it, what can it do that's quicker and better than humans, what can humans do, go back to my job as a data editor, what can humans do that are quicker and better than AI, and how do we harness the best of everyone's capabilities? Okay, so it really amuses me that we're suddenly like, oh, the whole world is AI, and that's how I got into this stuff. And here I am again, like the wheel has turned full circle.
Absolutely. I have no idea, Nathan, how much longer than the average episode this has gone, but this has just been the greatest conversation. I could keep talking for another hour about this stuff, but neither of us, I'm sure, have that kind of time. But I think this is probably a great place to end it with some of those considerations about how we keep, the humans involved, and there is still a role for researchers and people to give the respect to the people that take the time out to give us their feedback and fill out our surveys and take our usability tests and all these things. Caroline, has been an absolute pleasure getting to meet you and getting to talk to you about some of the things that I think both of us have experienced in our history with forms and surveys and questionnaires and MCCs and MCQs and VQs and whatever you want to call it. Gosh, I just had such a pleasure talking to you. I hope the audience really enjoys this as much as I did. So much fun. I thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, it's been great, and really appreciate the opportunity to geek out a bit about surveys, and then maybe we can geek out about forms some more another day or something. But in the meantime, yeah, there's a lot in surveys, and I'm glad you're seeing some of the fun and interest in it. And also, I'm so amused that I've been hit by my own jargon. That's great.
Terrific.
One thing I'd just like to mention, if I'm allowed, right at
Absolutely.
the end, is that one of the things that I'm really lucky to be with Rosenfeld Media as my publisher for Surveys That Work, and they love to support our community. So they've allowed me to offer people who tune in or listen to this podcast a 15% discount. It's valid through most of July 24. So if you go to Rosenfeld Media to get my book and use the code CJForms, FORMS 24, all uppercase, then that's good for a 15% discount. So a little commercial break there to finish this off.
And besides the book, Caroline, how else can people learn more about you and the work that you're doing?
Well, I think there used to be something we called social media. Do you remember that? I'm on what I now tend to think of as the dead bird side. It used to be called Twitter. I do check in occasionally, so I'm on there as CJ Forms. But these days I spend more time on something called Blue Sky. A few people might know. I'm on LinkedIn. I was actually one of the first 100,000 on LinkedIn or something. And there seem to be a few more professional conversations which are more fun starting up there now. But there's also the good old website. So my website is called Effortmark. That's like the word effort, EFFORT, followed by the word mark, MARK. Or if you I really impress my teenage nephews by, if you Google Caroline Jarrett, you actually get me, and that'll take you there. But the other thing is just ask me questions. My email address is there. I'm always interested to hear from people what your questions are. As you can tell, I love geeking out on this stuff, so feel very welcome. My email address is easy to find, and I'm delighted to hear from people.
Kindred spirits, for sure.